American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 14, The Bureaucracy. In this segment, the learning objective we'll be exploring is trying to understand where the power of bureaucracy derives from. And this is a very important part of understanding bureaucracy because bureaucracy is by nature expertise-based and thus is not democratic in its focus like the rest of government. So when we look at the power of bureaucracy, there are three different sources. The first comes from its rulemaking, the second from its ability to adjudicate, and lastly, its bureaucratic lobbying in the political process provides it authority and power. So let's take a look at rulemaking. Rulemaking is the process of deciding what the laws passed by Congress mean. So the definition of a rule is that it is a statement by a federal agency that interprets a law and prescribes the specific action an agency will take in implementing it. And the rules have the force of law. Now, the thing is Congress frequently passes laws that are intentionally vague. So there are specific goals, but there are no specific actions that's required by the government. And thus, Congress relies upon bureaucracy to do what is the dirty work. Now, their rulemaking, in turn, is governed by the Federal Administration Procedures Act. So there is a systematic and, indeed, there is democratic input into the process. So when we look at the rulemaking itself, we see that it is a highly difficult task that involves bringing in a variety of different perceptions and trying to get it through the process of lobbying in front of interest groups, congressional representatives, and the like. And so even something quite as simple as, what requirements are to develop mandatory bicycle helmet standards took 4 years. So the question is not just about the standards, but also whether or not children should be required to wear helmets, and that wasn't even addressed. So what we're looking at is a process that is oftentimes complex and convoluted, but attempts at its very hardest and its very finest to represent the American public and its needs to as great an extent as possible. Now, adjudication is a process designed to establish whether a rule has been violated. So we have the responsibilities of rulemaking and then adjudication in the bureaucracy. Now, that makes them very much like legislatures and courts. So in other words, what we have here is an institution that indeed is engaging in all three aspects of government with the execution, the legislating, and the adjudication, the judicial aspect of policymaking. And thus, the bureaucracy is a policy-making institution that is charged with very complex and oftentimes controversial roles. Bureaucracies are also involved in lobbying. Now, this is due to the fact that bureaucrats are in an ideal position to identify what has gone wrong with existing laws and programs and what their limitations are. As a result, they frequently recommend changes to the president and congressional committees. They know the ins and outs of the program and what doesn't work, and maybe not necessarily what does work, but certainly they might have insights that most policymakers and policy shapers might not have. So their source of power includes this expertise, as well as the fact that they might have close alliances with important groups and congressional committees that they developed over the course of years and even decades. Now, these relationships might be identified as either iron triangles or policy subsystems. Now, the difference is iron triangles are stable relationships among the bureaucracy, congressional committees, and interested parties outside of the government. In other words, clientele groups. Policy subsystems, on the other hand, as you can assume by the name, are networks of all the groups that share a particular policy interest, and they are not as stable as iron triangles as you assume by the term iron triangle. So let's delve a little bit deeper into the iron triangle. This is when a bureaucracy and interest group and a congressional committee cooperate on an issue area, and how they're cooperating is based upon where their power stems from. Congress gets credit from constituents for creating a popular program, and they then supply the money to run the program. And they also write the legislation in general terms. Now, this does a variety of things. First of all, it allows for them to claim credit when something does work. But when it does not work as planned, the legislators can attack the implementation of the policy instead of taking the blame themselves. In other words, they can blame the bureaucracy. And in other words, they can give bureaucracy a bad name for their failings. Now, constituents, for their part, supply the political support to legislators, and this can be in the form of votes, money, or even insight, in return for a program to support them. They also provide the information to bureaucrats concerning the program needs and implementation. So they're certainly benefiting as long as they provide support to both the legislators and the bureaucrats, which develops a really tight relationship here. Now, finally, the bureaucrats, they provide the program to the clientele and they receive the financial support from Congress. As a result, they might be captured, indeed become a prisoner of the clientele or constituency groups, and basically do their bidding as opposed to the bidding of the U.S. public. So it looks like this. In Figure 14.2, we see an iron triangle, which the bureaucracy provides favorable regulation to special interest groups, who provide electoral support to Congress, who provide funding to the bureaucracy. So it's a fairly tight connection here, especially if you have a limited amount of special interest groups involved. However, when these interest groups start expanding, you have a greater number of them, and there's no set group of people, as is the case with Iron Triangle, you have issue networks. So this is a fluid and loose grouping of people and organizations to influence policy formation. So in this graphic, we see a variety of different interests that have influence over healthcare and what happens. And certainly when you're involved with politics, the larger the issue, the more money that's involved, the more likely you're going to have an awful lot of different political interests involved with this. So the issue networks are based on the idea that interest groups have some level of control or influence over bureaucratic politics. Now, Paul Sabatier and Hank Jenkins Smith in 1988 and more recently have provided the best way of conceptualizing these issue networks. And what they do is they suggest that instead of looking at them in terms of the players, you look at what the players' value, priorities, and causal assumptions are. In other words, what their belief systems are. And look at them in the term of teams. Now, in my own research, I found that this is very useful. Indeed, I found that within the area of agricultural biotechnology policy, that you can consider two very different groups involved with it, with bureaucracy essentially stuck in the middle. So when we consider politics of bureaucracy, we see that there are these three different approaches, but they are all influenced by external actors. So to a great extent, there is influence for the American public through interest groups. Now, hopefully, the interest groups reflect the needs of the American public and not just the moneyed interests. American national government.